There are over 35,000 veterans sleeping outside in America tonight, and the government has spent billions trying to get them off the streets. But here is something almost nobody talks about. A huge number of those veterans had a chance to go inside. They were offered a bed, a warm room, a roof over their heads, and they said no, not because they wanted to suffer. Not because they were too proud or too far gone. They said no because of a dog. And the story of why that happened and what one group of veterans did to fix it reveals something deeply broken about how America treats the people who served it. Let's start with a number that will stick with you. According to research on veteran homelessness, somewhere between 10 and 25% of homeless veterans who were offered emergency shelter turned it down specifically because shelters do not allow pets. That is not a small rounding error. That is thousands of people on any given night choosing a sidewalk over a bed because they refused to abandon the one living thing that had not abandoned them. Now, if you have never been in that position, that might sound irrational to you. It might even sound stubborn. But stick with me here, because once you understand what these animals actually mean to veterans and what many veterans have been through, the decision stops sounding irrational. It starts sounding completely human. Most of the veterans who end up homeless did not fall apart all at once. It usually happens in pieces, over years. They come back from deployment, and the world that was supposed to feel normal feels completely foreign. The sounds are wrong. The crowds are wrong. The pace is wrong. Relationships fall apart. Jobs do not stick. Some turn to alcohol or drugs just to sleep at night. The spiral is slow enough that by the time they realize how far they have fallen, they are already on the street. During that process, most of them lose everything. Their savings, their apartment, their family connections, their sense of who they are outside of the military. But some of them, along the way, got a dog. And that dog became the last stable thing in their life. Veterans who have been through this describe their dogs in terms that might surprise you. They do not just say the dog was nice or kept them company. They say things like, the dog gave them a reason to get up in the morning. The dog needed to be fed, so they had to find food. The dog needed to be walked, so they had to leave wherever they were sleeping and go outside. When everything else was chaos, the dog was a routine. And routine, for someone whose whole life has just collapsed, is basically a lifeline. There are also documented psychological reasons why dogs are so important, specifically to veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress. Dogs can sense changes in their owner's breathing and heart rate. They respond to anxiety before the person fully realizes they are having an episode. Some veterans describe waking up from nightmares to find their dog already pressing against them, already trying to calm them down without being asked. There is a reason trained service dogs for PTSD are in high demand and extremely expensive. What homeless veterans have is not a trained service dog in the official sense. But what their dogs do, functionally, is very similar. So when a shelter says no pets, what the veteran hears is not just leave your dog outside. What they hear is leave behind your routine, your sense of purpose, the only thing that has not let you down, the thing that keeps you alive on your worst nights. And that is a trade a lot of them are not willing to make. Most shelters, even the ones specifically designed for veterans, had this rule for years. And for years, people working in homeless outreach knew it was a problem. They would encounter veterans on the street, offer them a bed, and watch the person look down at the dog sitting next to them and say, "What about him?" The answer was almost always the same. We cannot take the dog. And the veterans stayed outside. This was the situation that a group of combat veterans in Kansas City, Missouri, were looking at in 2016 when they founded an organization called the Veterans Community Project. The founders were men who had served overseas and come home to watch their fellow veterans fall through every gap in the system. They had seen the statistics. They knew that existing programs were failing. Nationally, only about 25 to 40% of homeless veterans who entered transitional housing ever made it to permanent housing. The rest cycled back to the street. The system was designed in ways that made sense on paper, but did not match the reality of what veterans actually needed, so they decided to start from scratch. They were going to build a village of small homes, surround it with actual support services, and design every single part of it by talking directly to veterans who were living outside. That last part is what made all the difference. When they went out onto the streets and asked veterans what they needed, they heard a lot of answers. They heard about the need for privacy after years of sharing barracks and tents. They heard about the fear of being in a shelter with strangers after coming back from combat zones where trusting the wrong person could get you killed. They heard about needing structure but not wanting to feel like they were back in the military. And they heard, over and over, about the dogs. Veteran after veteran told them the same thing. I would go inside. I want to go inside. But I am not giving up my dog. So the Veterans Community Project made a decision that sounds simple, but was actually a major shift in how veteran housing programs work. They made the village pet-friendly. Not just, we will try to work something out, pet-friendly. Actually, fully, completely pet-friendly. They built a pet wash station inside the village. They arranged access to veterinary care. They created an off-leash area where dogs could run. They treated the animals as part of the community because, for the veterans living there, they were. The village itself opened its first campus on the east side of Kansas City, and the design was unlike anything else that existed in veteran housing at the time. They built 49 tiny homes, each one between 240 and 320 square feet. Every home met local building codes. Every home connected to city utilities. Every home came fully stocked when a veteran moved in. Furniture, appliances, dishes, bedding, and food already in the kitchen. The cost to build each home ran about $10,000, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to what traditional emergency shelters cost to build and operate, which runs into millions. The homes sat on a real piece of land, with real addresses, in a real neighborhood. Not a parking lot with trailers, not a warehouse with cots. A village with front doors and doormats and small porches where you could sit outside in the evening if you wanted, but the homes were only the beginning. Across the street from the village, they built a community center that gave veterans access to case managers, job placement services, dental care, counseling, financial literacy classes, legal help, a food pantry, and a clothing closet. Everything they might need to actually put their life back together, not just to survive from one day to the next. One of the veterans who came through the program was a former Marine named Alio Caldwell. He had served his country, come home, watched his relationship fall apart, and spent 5 years on the streets of Kansas City before he found the village. He later described looking around at older men on the street, men who had clearly been outside for decades, and deciding he did not want that to be his future. He moved into one of the tiny homes. He worked with a case manager. He started applying for jobs, which he could do because he now had a real address to put on the application. He started sleeping through the night, which he could do because he was finally in a quiet, private space. He started thinking about next month instead of just surviving until tomorrow. That shift, from surviving to planning, is not small. It is the difference between being stuck in crisis and beginning to build something. The program asks veterans to stay for an average of 14 to 16 months. During that time, case managers stay closely involved. And when a veteran is ready to move into permanent housing, they take everything with them. The furniture, the appliances, the dishes, all of it. They walk into their new apartment with a full kitchen already set up and a bed already made. Volunteers then come in and refresh the tiny home so it looks brand new for the next person walking through the door. And for veterans with dogs, that dog goes with them too, through every step of the process, into the village, into the community, and into whatever comes next. The pet-friendly policy did something nobody fully predicted. It did not just bring in veterans who had refused shelters because of their animals. It changed the entire culture of the village. Veterans who moved in with dogs quickly became more connected to their neighbors. They walked their dogs in the morning and ran into other veterans doing the same thing. They talked. They started looking out for each other. The off-leash area became a place where people gathered in the evenings without it being a formal program or a scheduled activity. It was just people and their dogs in a shared space, being part of a community. That kind of organic connection is extremely hard to manufacture with services and programs. You can schedule group therapy and job skills, workshops, and those things matter. But the informal bonds that form between people who are going through something similar, who see each other every day and check in on each other, those are often what actually hold a recovery together when things get hard. The dogs created that. Veterans organizations and researchers who have looked at the program talk about animals as social bridges. A person who might be too guarded or too ashamed to strike up a conversation with a neighbor will talk about their dog. And then they are talking. And then they know each other's names. And then when one of them is having a hard day, the other one notices. This is not something anyone would have put in a grant proposal or a policy white paper, but it is real. And the Veterans Community Project understood it because they were not designing a program from a conference room. They were designing it from conversations with the people who were going to live in it. The numbers behind the program are striking. The national rate of veteran homelessness has dropped more than 55% since 2010. In 2025, the projected count was around 31,800 veterans experiencing homelessness nationally, which is still too many, but it is a massive improvement from where things stood at the start of the decade. The Veterans Community Project is considered one of the major drivers of that reduction. Their model has now expanded to St. Louis, with additional cities in development. Compare that trajectory to programs that spent far more and achieved far less. In Los Angeles, the city spent $300 million on a homeless housing initiative. According to their own data, roughly 40% of the people placed into housing ended up back on the streets. $300 million, and nearly half the people were right back where they started. The difference is not just about tiny homes versus traditional housing. It is about whether the people designing the program actually listened to the people they were trying to help. The Veterans Community Project listened. They heard, "I need privacy, not a bunk in a room with 50 strangers." They heard, "I need an address so I can apply for a job." They heard, "I need support that stays with me after I leave, not support that disappears the day I sign a new lease." And they heard, "I am not leaving my dog." So they built a place that said, "You do not have to." There is something that feels important to sit with at the end of this story. The veterans who refused shelter to stay with their dogs were not being irrational. They were not being difficult. They were making a completely understandable choice based on real lived experience. They had already lost almost everything. The dog was proof that at least one bond in their life had held, and they were not wrong to protect it. The system failed them by treating that bond as an obstacle rather than understanding it as a resource. Because a veteran who has kept an animal alive and cared for through years of homelessness has demonstrated something important about themselves. They have shown that they can show up for something every day, that they can put another creature's needs before their own, that they have not given up entirely on being responsible for something that depends on them. That is not a problem to be solved. That is a foundation to build on. The Veterans Community Project figured that out. And somewhere in Kansas City right now, there is a veteran who is sleeping in a quiet room in a tiny house with a real lock on the door and a dog curled up at the foot of the bed. And for the first time in years, that veteran has a reason to think about next month. That is what it looks like when a program actually works. Hit subscribe if this is the kind of story you want more of.